We're looking at the biology of the most fit people in the world to understand what works in their bodies, what's sort of enriched or naturally selected to drive optimal physiology. And then we could take those learnings and that biological data and translate that into health solutions for everyone. I guess to be tongue-in-cheek, it's kind of like be like Mike, except for real. And when you talk about elite athletes, yes, we could talk about sports and entertainment, but just from a physiological perspective, these essentially are like the 0.01% of the human population in terms of things like endurance, strength, mental toughness, recovery. So we're basically going to this super rare biological population to see what's enriched in their bodies and then utilize that to develop these solutions that everyone can benefit from.
Welcome to Biohacking with Brittany, where high performance health meets non-toxic living. I'm Brittany Ford, a holistic nutritionist, bringing you science-backed strategies in biohacking, longevity, and holistic wellness. Whether you're navigating fertility, pregnancy, postpartum, or simply striving for optimal well-being, you're in the right place. Let's dive in. Welcome back, everybody, to the podcast. Thank you for tuning in to today's episode. This was a really fun episode. I got to sit down with Dr. Jonathan Scheiman, who is the co-founder of FitBiomics. This is a really cool company. Essentially, what they're doing is they're taking a look at the microbiome, the probiotics, the bacteria of elite athletes, and saying, hey, what do they have that the average person might not have? And how can we utilize that to help people feel better energetically, fight fatigue naturally, break down lactic acid, and really just change how the average person might show up in the world based off of the bacteria that is in the microbiome of these 1%, these top elite athletes who are just crushing it in their zones, in their sports or whatever they might be doing. So it was really cool to take a look at this and break this down and, really look at it from a brand new angle. I think the probiotic world is just honestly blossoming and it's just huge. There's more and more strains we're learning about that do specific things. And we're getting so detailed and like micro about it that it's really cool to see science moving in this way rather than just, everyone taking the same probiotic or the same strains. We're looking at things in a much more specific way. And I think that is great. People often think probiotics are just for digestion, but it's like, actually, what could we do with this bacteria, or what can the bacteria do to support energy, immunity, and mental clarity? So that's what we dive into today. I think you're going to get a lot out of this. There's always something to learn in this space, and that's what I love about it. Health, energy, longevity, microbiome, one of my favorite topics to just kind of nerd out on and hear all about. And speaking of gut health, before we dive in, a shout out to Bioptimizers, who create the best digestive enzymes on the planet. I kid you not. These are my favorite. I travel with them. I have a bottle in my pantry, in my car, in my suitcase, at my desk, at work, everywhere. They help me digest everything. And they help me digest gluten, lactose, all of the proteins that I might eat that I typically don't. And even if I eat a very heavy meal. So we just had Mother's Day and I definitely ate more than normal. I had a lot more sugar than normal as well. I was feeling quite big and bloated, that type of thing. So I took a bunch of digestive enzymes and it really helped to reduce that feeling. They also help to absorb your protein. So this is something cool that I was just learning about recently is even if we eat a certain amount of grams of protein in a meal, it actually doesn't mean that we absorb all of them. So rather than trying to eat more and more and more protein, protein's having such a hot minute right now, everyone's talking about it. Let's actually talk about absorbing more of the protein that we're currently eating. And that's what the probiotics do. They help with absorption, they help with digestion. They're really phenomenal. I highly suggest them if you're having any digestive issues or you want to optimize your protein intake. Check out Bioptimizers. Use my discount code BiohackingBrittany and you can get 10% off of all of their products. And let me know. If you have any questions, my DMs are always open on Instagram at BiohackingBrittany. I hope you love this episode and I will catch you soon for another one. Welcome back to Biohacking with Brittany. Today, we are diving into one of the most important, honestly, yet underrated keys to health, energy, and longevity, and that is our gut microbiome. Joining me is Dr. Jonathan Scheiman, who is the CEO and co-founder of FitBiomics, a biotech company that's flipping the script on what probiotics can actually do. So I'm really excited about this because we're not just going to talk about gut health. We're actually going to talk about how gut health impacts our hormones, performance, aging, and even women's health, and why women can really benefit from taking specific strains of probiotics. So there's so much to dive into today. We might even talk about GLP-1 drugs like Ozempic, which I know are super popular right now. So Dr. Jonathan, welcome to the show.
Hello, great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thank you for joining us. So I would love to kind of kick this off with gut health for energy in general. I think, and I know you guys kind of talk about this, I think there is this understanding of probiotics are super great for digestion, but what about what it can actually, or they can actually do for us on a daily basis when we're talking about feeling more energized when we get up in the morning?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important to just kind of understand, just in terms of our biologies and our bodies, what the microbiome is. And maybe now microbiomes are in vogue, although it is pretty important to realize that, the field is still fairly nascent. I mean, maybe 2012 is when the NIH's Human Microbiome Project was completed. But, I think just some baseline level setting stuff. I think everyone has heard we're as much bacteria as we are human. We have trillions of microorganisms in and on our body. A lot of them, reside in our gut. And basically every aspect of our bodies interface with these gut microbes. And to your point, everything from energy metabolism, protein metabolism, neurology, immunology, basically everything we eat. Think about that in terms of energy and metabolic pathways, interfaces with our microbes. Actually, a lot of the things that we eat, our bodies can't physically digest. We sort of rely on these microbes to break them down into nutrients that our bodies can absorb. And then, of course, if you're thinking about just energy in general, things in terms of muscle health, bone health, metabolites that our cells could use, even sort of brain function and things of that nature. Basically, it's all comes down to, in large part, what these microbes in our bodies are doing.
Yeah, and you started FitBiomics by studying the gut microbiomes of elite athletes. Why did you think that there would be something there that we potentially don't understand and you really wanted to discover?
Yeah, I think, I'm a big believer. So my background, PhD in biomedicine, I then did my postdoc at Harvard, really sort of in a lab that develops tools to understand nature. Actually, the institute is called the Wyss Institute for Biologically Inspired Engineering. And I'm a big believer in form fits function and natural selection. I think a lot of times in medicine, we look at diseased physiology or populations to sort of learn what's broken and try to find ways to correct that for health purposes. What FitBiomics is doing is almost the exact opposite. We're looking at the biology of the most fit people in the world to understand what works in their bodies, what's sort of enriched or naturally selected to drive optimal physiology. And then we could take those learnings and that biological data and translate that into health solutions for everyone. I guess to be tongue-in-cheek, it's kind of like be like Mike, except for real. And when you talk about elite athletes, yes, we could talk about sports and entertainment, but just from a physiological perspective, these essentially are like the 0.01% of the human population in terms of things like endurance, strength, mental toughness, recovery. So we're basically going to this super rare biological population to see what's enriched in their bodies and then utilize that to develop these solutions that everyone can benefit from.
And then one of the biggest discoveries in this space was a bacteria called V-Nella. I think I might be saying that correctly. How does that specific strain impact endurance and energy?
Yeah, everything is really cool. For V-Nella, when we were at Harvard, we worked with ultramarathon runners, and these are people that run 100 miles at a time. We studied their gut microbiome from performance to recovery phases and basically how their microbiome ecosystem changes over time. And we identified that immediately after intense exercise, there was this spike in abundance of V-Nella, and pretty cool, it naturally eats lactic acid, which is a metabolite associated with fatigue in our bodies, eats that up in order to actually fight fatigue and promote endurance. So if you think about energy, endurance, physical performance, and fatigue, here's this microbe that's enriched in the guts of these super performers that we now turned into probiotic for everyone.
And how do you think, like, so say I was training for something. I'm just laughing at the idea of me doing a 100-mile run. Say I was training for something like that and, I were to take this probiotic strain. Do you think I would actually be able to move the needle on my training and performance? Or do you think it's like one pillar alongside nutrition, sleep, and everything else? And it can kind of just support that once we have like the low hanging fruit in place?
Yeah, this is going to be a fun conversation. So the answer is yes to all of the above. But one thing I would say is just to reframe the conversation. I wouldn't necessarily look at something like V-Nella to help you train for a marathon. How about just V-Nella to help you train for life? If you think about fatigue and as an epidemic in our society and how chronic fatigue, long COVID, perimenopause, menopause, metabolic health, right? GLP-1s. I think the notion of just having people be less tired and more physically active, it sounds so simple, but it's actually pretty profound in terms of the impacts it could have on our collective health. To your point, can something like V-Nella actually help? Well, fortunately, that's not necessarily a subjective question. Actually, we have a bunch of clinical data that shows V-Nella is improving not just run till exhaustion and VO2 max, but also just helping everyday people with fatigue on a daily level. So it's something that, honestly, is still relatively new to the world. We brought it to market around 8 months ago, but it's already, I think, being disruptive in terms of how people deal with daily fatigue issues.
Yeah, that's awesome. Fatigue is such a big issue, and I see it in my friends and family. And it's kind of this idea of, waking up in the morning and just feeling like, oh my goodness, I need 5 cups of coffee right now in order to get through my day. I'm juggling too much. I'm overstressed. And that notion is kind of everywhere in society. And I don't know if it's getting better. I don't know what you see, especially in New York City, but what I see is like just more and more people being chronically tired and overwhelmed.
Yeah. I mean, I think the coffee thing is interesting, right? I mean, energy drinks, coffee, the energy industry is so huge, right? And we could talk about different things, right? From like stimulants and nootropics to drinks and beverages to even just cellular energy and what people are using for like mitochondria and stuff like that. I just think we're a very overstimulated society, even according to the CDC, right? I think if you look at chronic disease, right, 60% of all US adults have at least one chronic disease. It costs the government $4 trillion a year in terms of healthcare costs. And some of the leading factors leading up to that are basically just like sedentary lifestyles and poor diets. So I feel like we're overstimulated, yet we're kind of very sedentary and we're not eating healthy. So all of this is contributing to, I think, the problems we're seeing, but how things just like fatigue and energy play such a huge factor in all of this.
Yeah, absolutely. And how do you see hormones kind of connecting to all of this, whether it's for females or for males? What is that kind of link there that people might not understand between gut health and hormones?
Yeah, I think it's all, relevant. Think of our gut really as like this fermentation factory. And, all of what we eat goes through our gut. 70% of our immune system, basically interacts with our gut. It synthesizes neurotransmitters, it synthesizes hormones, GLP-1s, which are peptides, are naturally produced in the gut. So basically, our gut is essentially determining all aspects of our physiology. For men, obviously, testosterone, right, is a huge thing and how that has implications for men, especially as they age. And then for women, sort of estrogen and obviously that's a big role as women age and, perimenopause and menopause as well. So, this notion of finding cellular energy sources that could help us as we get older, I think is very relevant for us in terms of our health and functionality. And certainly the microbiome is an important role in that aspect.
Absolutely. I love that we're actually learning about all of these connections. Like I don't know if you see it, but I see it like the gut-brain connection, the gut hormones connection, like everything is kind of linking back to the gut in a different, or even gut-skin connection now. And people are talking about that. And I just think it's really profound to take a look at something that is more of the root cause of what might be causing these issues, rather than just trying to take something like Ozempic and, lose weight in that way. But rather than doing that, like, let's actually look at what's going on with our gut bacteria and how our gut is functioning in itself, so that we can be in this place of more of root cause medicine, as they're calling it now, and heal kind of more profoundly in that way.
Yeah. I think they're all connected, right? I think diet, medicine. It's interesting. I think supplements, traditionally have and even probiotics, a negative connotation because, as their name is, it's supplemental. But I think because of societal health and the way things are going, supplements are actually becoming essential. I think a lot of our food supply is having diminished sort of, nutrients in them. And there's a lot to sort of discuss there. But I think all of these things are connected and interface. And certainly some of the innovations, whether it's lactic acid, whether it's physical activity, whether it's propionate as a short chain fatty acid that's powering our mitochondria, or whether it's these other microbes we discovered that's powering sleep, reducing cortisol. Again, all these things are sort of interacting. And in general, I think if people are more active, they're exercising more, that's going to help out, holistic health. And, if people are sleeping better, I guess the point is that all of this stuff is interconnected and they're sort of reinforcing one another.
Absolutely. I wonder if there's a way, and like there probably isn't. I'm just thinking about our gut microbiomes and the people that you've spent time studying. And I'm thinking back decades ago, like I would be so curious to look at the microbiome of somebody 100 years ago and look at their gut bacteria, and someone who, didn't have screens and technology and like probably lived on a farm and made all of their food. And like, do you know what I mean? Like, I just wonder, obviously they had their own health issues at that time, but I don't know if the things that plague us now, like fatigue, stress, these hormonal issues, chronic issues, I don't know if that would have been as prevalent back then. And so I'm just so curious. I don't think it's possible, but I just so wonder what their gut microbiomes look like in living in such a more natural way of living, I guess.
Yeah, so actually it is possible. And it's something that one of our co-founders at Harvard's Joslin Institute for Diabetes is studying. So this notion of ancient microbiomes versus modern microbiomes. And again, I think everything has to be put in the context of, the environment and our surroundings. There's always nature versus nurture. But actually, for instance, V-Nella and things, there's an interesting sort of evolutionary story. If you look at sort of hunter-gatherers or folks that live in sort of urban or westernized societies, their microbiomes are really, really different and sort of are prone towards, digestion fibers and things of that nature. I think if you look at the modern Western microbiomes and, these were being assaulted by high fat, salt, sugar, antibiotics, sedentary lifestyles. What's also really interesting, if you look at ancient microbiomes of like hunter-gatherers, think about it. Back in the day, if you will, you had to be more physically active just to sort of find food, right? So you had to hunt more, so something like endurance was selected for because you had to have physical endurance to find your food. Whereas if you look at today and everything is so easily accessible or downloadable, or you could order them and we're so sedentary, our microbiomes are shifted. And there's an interesting connection there to even elite athletes, right? Because these are the only, people in the population, because they're so physically active, they're enriching and selecting for microbes like V-Nella because it's part of their physiology. And that's the big joke, right? I think today it's almost like you have to be an elite athlete to have these optimized microbes. But, the great thing is, we're sort of decoding this, translating, and now everyone could have sort of these elite endurance microbes, if you will.
I'm wondering as well, like you mentioned nature versus nurture. And I recently was just in Central America for a few weeks. And when I was there, I was actually thinking about this. I was thinking, my diet was so different, and all the fruits and vegetables literally came from like the place that I was in, the country that I was in, versus Canada, where we import everything from Mexico and the States, and we just don't have the landscape and the weather here to grow papaya and like all of these different fruits and vegetables, right? And I was thinking, I wonder how my health is changing right now on a cellular level by eating a completely different diet that's more nutrient dense. But then also, how does that impact my microbiome? And so, my question, I guess, is how long would it take for you to live in a different country like Costa Rica or Nicaragua for a certain amount of time? Like, how long would it take for my gut to reflect that, hey, you're living somewhere different and now we reflect the environment that you're in? At some point, we've all been sold a big lie, including yours truly. It's called the protein lie. Starting in the 80s, supplement companies began pushing massive protein consumption. We all believed that more protein equaled more muscle growth. And I'm here to tell you that is a big fat lie. So let's say you eat an 8-ounce chicken breast and you're consuming about 40 grams of protein. However, just because something contains 40 grams of protein, it doesn't necessarily mean you're going to absorb all 40 grams. Without enzymes, most of it ends up in the toilet bowl. Ouch. This is because your small intestine can only absorb protein that's been broken down into smaller building blocks called amino acids. It doesn't matter if you're consuming 30 grams of protein or 300 grams of protein. If you don't have a sufficient supply of enzymes to digest that protein, your muscles will be starving for those vital building blocks. That's why it's crucial you take a high quality enzyme. Before you run out and buy a bottle of enzymes, you need to know exactly what to look for. The sad truth is most enzymes are of little to no value if you want to build muscle. The hefty costs stop most companies from developing and stabilizing proteolytic enzymes. And so that's why the one that I trust and I use myself and love, and honestly, my whole entire family uses it, is called Mass Enzymes by Optimizers. Mass Enzymes is a full spectrum enzyme formula with more protease than any other commercially available, with 5 different kinds of protease. Plus, it contains all the other key enzymes you need for optimal digestion. Mass Enzymes is a full spectrum enzyme formula, and this is my go-to. And you can try it today, risk-free. Their 365-day full money-back guarantee is the gold standard in the industry. So go to bioptimizers.com/biohackingbrittany and use my discount code biohackingbrittany and you will get 10% off your order. I literally have a bottle of this Mass Enzymes in my car, at work, in my pantry, everywhere. I use it for big meals if I eat anything that's a little out of the ordinary. And it really helps me to feel better in my digestion and also makes me so much happier that I am absorbing my protein and getting the gains that I want. We all want more gains. So check it out and enjoy digesting your protein better.
Yeah, I mean, it's probably a lot quicker than we anticipate. For instance, even I remember, a decade ago, right, initially having ideas for these athlete microbiomes and looking at their guts longitudinally. I think a lot of people didn't really appreciate or anticipate the dynamic nature of our microbiome and how quickly it actually shifts. For instance, the spike in V-Nella happens something like hours after, intense exercise or training, certainly within 24 hours. And it's the same thing with like travel or diet-induced changes. You could see these within a couple of days, right? So, obviously it might take longer to manifest itself into these, holistic health changes or metabolic or physiological differences. But microbial composition changes fairly quickly, right? And a lot of it is based upon what we eat, our environment, and physical activity.
Yeah, I think it is. I think you're right. I think it is sooner. And I think I actually read somewhere, you can correct me if I'm wrong, that like the microbiome, it looks completely different about like every 5 days or so.
I think it just depends on travel certainly has a big impact, like especially if you're going into a different country. It is interesting. What's cool about the microbiome, and this is done mostly from like a, I guess a safety perspective. There's tremendous variability, I think, in the microbes in our gut, especially from person to person. But, what actually you see is there's a lot of functional redundancy in those microbes. So while composition might be different, and that could change fairly rapidly, sort of what those microbes are doing can stay fairly consistent over time. But so it's a little, it's a little nuanced and stuff like that. And then, what's pretty interesting is how are we acquiring microbes in our gut? And, obviously, you probably know this. The first 3 years of our lives are kind of when our microbiomes are the most dynamic as a baby, and it really shifts around. I think by 3 years of age is when we kind of reach this quote unquote mature microbial state in our gut. But then from there, as you might imagine, our lifestyles are greatly, greatly impacting this. And again, if you're shifting towards more sedentary Western diet lifestyle, right, versus maybe a more active, high fiber, kind of lifestyle, these things will compound over time.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Yeah, I've actually had my gut microbiome tested, and I had my baby's gut microbiome tested. He's almost 10 months, and it was really interesting to see the different bacteria and what kind of probiotics he should be on, especially ones that actually feed off of breast milk, which is a whole nother discussion. But it was really cool to take a look at that. And he was a C-section baby. And so it was very important for me to be like, hey, how can we support his microbiome in a very holistic way for the first few years, exactly like you're saying?
Yeah. I want to say something which is very interesting because I know the topic of discussion here is like biohacking, right? But I think biohacking could be a very, very broad term, right? I mean, I even look at things like, again, just evolution, natural selection, using technology sort of to decode what's working and select communities. That's almost like a form of biohacking, right? To your point, bacteria that are feeding off of breast milk and stuff like that, and how evolution is selected for, like, yeah, here's a process where we can use biology to help like our offspring be healthier, right? And you could imagine how that gets disrupted with industrialization, other technology, things that are affecting our supply chain, right? It is also interesting, right? If you think about chronic disease and epidemic and a lot of this, it's maybe not necessarily something that was intended, right? If you look at industrialization of food and things like that, a lot of it was done to, address, hunger, right? And sort of like making food cheaper and quicker and accessible. But obviously, if you're reducing the nutrient intake and the quality of that food, there's going to be repercussions downstream. So everything is kind of like competition, selection. But I would say all of it falls under this broad umbrella of biohacking, if you will.
Absolutely. Yeah. And it's kind of cool to look at it like that. Yeah. Biohacking is a very like trendy term for things that we have been doing for a very long time. And like you said, I think it's very, very broad and can be applied to different things. Something else that you do talk about is longevity. And honestly, longevity is also a very hot word right now. I see it everywhere. The last couple of years, I swear, like so many of the doctors that I follow have been putting out like longevity books, and it's like the new buzzword. But anyway, I know you also talk about like vitality versus longevity versus health span and lifespan. And I think that's so interesting to kind of actually separate those. So how, like, what is the difference that you see between those different words?
Yeah, I think it's funny. We could all, even like I like to have fun with this. Semantics is such an interesting aspect of, getting in these circular conversations where maybe we all want the same things. And I think something like vitality, right, in our life and just being more active and healthy and stronger, right, both mentally and physically, that ultimately I think is what leads to longevity, right? And I think, this notion of health span versus lifespan, again, I think this also goes into disease and prevention and things like that. I think with medication and sort of treating symptoms, you could live longer. But I think if you introduce modalities into your life that increase vitality, you're not only living longer, but you're living longer healthier. And I think, again, that's the difference between lifespan and health span, not just increasing the number of years you have on this planet, but making sure those years are actually you could be active and healthy. And again, I think that all ties into, things like metabolic health, fatigue, sleep, our gut microbiome, and really optimizing our biology to make sure we have vitality, right? So we could be stronger, more active, less tired, So that way we can not just live longer, but live healthier while we're here.
I love this concept and I've heard it for quite a while. And I try to explain it to my family and they're like, what? What do you mean? Yeah. And I think it is becoming more popular, but I, I think there's so much to be said about let's spend more years that we have left in a healthier state than just like letting them go by type of vibe.
Well, this is what I'm talking about too, right? I think when you talk to doctors, scientists, consumers, right, millennials, parents, people above 65, I think at the end of the day, the semantics don't really matter, right? I think at the end of the day, we just want to be healthy and sort of be healthier longer. And the question is, how do we get there? And that's what I think, tying it back to FitBiomics and our thesis, right? It's just this notion of, well, why don't we understand what's working in the healthiest people in the world that are active and then apply those principles for everyone, right? Because, this notion of, again, think about ultra marathons, right? Life is an ultra marathon, right? And I think we all want to train to sort of live the 100 miles of life, if you will, or if not more. So, do we have the nutritional tools, the sort of like health innovations or modalities that could basically support our bodies on that 100, ultra marathon journey of life? And again, I just want to say it doesn't have to be so difficult, right? It's just, I always say with something like V-Nella, right? Fatigue less and move more, right? There's a probiotic for that. And it's that simple, but yet that simplicity has profound impacts. And again, even if you look at the mechanism of action from a metabolic health standpoint and lactate, instead of going to glucose being converted into propionate and how that's now powering our mitochondria, muscles, right? Like there's so many biological aspects to it, but at the end of the day, it's just a simple concept of being less tired and moving more.
Yeah. Simple concept, yet a lot of people struggle to actually do that and get really worn down. Yeah. And I wonder as well how this is affecting like Gen Z or even the generation after that, Gen Alpha, and what their microbiomes are going to look like when, they're adults in society, 40s, 50s, whatever it might be, with this age of, and it's probably because I just have a baby that I'm like very much in this world, but I see all the little iPad kids everywhere, the iPad toddlers, and they're already less active at such an active age. So what happens to their microbiomes once they're in their 30s, 40s, when you really have to start putting in the effort to maintain activity in order to maintain your health? Like, I guess we'll have to wait to kind of get the studies and the research done on that.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think we kind of already have the answer, right? I mean, if you just look at the past, 20 to 30 to 40 years and this rise of chronic disease, right? This rise of diabetes, this rise of obesity and, metabolic syndrome. Again, we kind of have the answers, right? According to the CDC, the leading drivers of chronic disease are sedentary lifestyles and our poor diets. So another way to say that is, what we eat and lack of exercise is killing us way more effectively than anything we could think of, right? I mean, that's just, the data is there, right? It's a crazy concept. So I think this notion of exercise is medicine, movement is medicine, right? And combating fatigue to help people be more active. Obviously, it's so simple, but it's such an important aspect of our daily lives. The other thing I want to say too is, I feel my generation, right? If you look at sort of health, what is it, lifespan, I think for the first time in like several generations, we've kind of reached the plateau of life expectancy in this country, right? And it's actually going down. So it used to be that, the next generation would look forward to new technologies or modalities or interventions to like live longer than the previous one. But actually now that's changing. I feel like the Gen Alphas or like your son, I think because we've like awoken to maybe the issues that we're having in our food supply system and sedentary lifestyles, I think now we'll start to correct that. Where I feel like sort of our generation maybe is bearing the brunt of that, but I do feel we'll now sort of use new, innovations and technologies to course correct, if you will.
Yeah, I hope so. I hope there is that shift there that says, hey, we've seen what this has done and we can do better. But it's a systemic, like multifactorial issue, right? Like it's not going to just, the solution's not just from one person or one supplement. It's way bigger than that.
Yeah. But I do think, innovation and technology takes time. And I think it is important to say this, right? And just from my background, right? If you think of like the human genome, right? It was first published a little over 20 years ago, 2003. It was a project that took 15 years and $3 billion, right? Today we could sequence a genome for $1,000 in 2 days, right? So you're talking about orders of magnitude increase in sort of like our technological capabilities and how it leads to discoveries. Even with GLP-1s, I think it's important to say that, GLP-1s were discovered 40 years ago, right? And it wasn't until maybe a few years ago that they really gained popularity and importance. And even to the point now where they're being offered on, telemedicine platforms, they're sort of being introduced into like CVS and pharmacies. So I do think with new technology, are going to accelerate not just diagnostics, but also interventions. So, but then again, I'm an optimist. I'm a glass half full kind of guy because, this is the stuff that I live.
Yeah. And honestly, you kind of have to be like, I like to be in the optimistic, like hope state, because otherwise it's just despair and it's too stressful. and, and I do think there has been a massive shift already in society, like towards wellness and self-care and like these general concepts, which is really nice to see. But I'm curious about GLP-1 meds like Ozempic, like you just talked about, that can cause side effects like muscle loss. And I actually just saw a woman yesterday on social media talking about hair loss, which is something that I haven't seen. And she was talking about linking it to her Ozempic and her situation with that. So how can probiotics or gut health potentially be tied to that? And what are your thoughts around that?
Yeah, I look at GLP-1s, right? When you have a society where 70% of the population is overweight and 40% of that population is obese, clearly there is a critical and urgent need for interventions that could address that, right? And I also want to be clear, right? I think a lot of times there's this blame the victim kind of thing, right? Well, it's, oh, if you're overweight, you're just lazy, right? Like I don't think that is true at all. As we spoke about, I think it's harder and harder to have a healthier lifestyle, whether that's access to nutritious food that's affordable and stuff like that, right? You have to pay premiums for things that are like organic or stuff like that, right? I also think, as we spoke about, just with technology, with society, everyone being overworked, healthcare access not really being affordable, there's so much working against us, right, in modern society that unless you're either an elite athlete, right, or you are relatively affluent, it's going to be hard to gain access to tools for health and longevity. And metabolic health and obesity is just one, aspect of that. So let me just state that loaded prologue up front. So I think GLP-1s play an important role in society. Do I think they're an end all be all? No. But I do think if you look at just the amount of weight people lose with exercise alone, certainly GLP-1s are efficacious in that regard. I think to your point, the problem might be is one, the side effects, two, gaining weight back after people stop using them. So weaning off of them. And I do also think, you could use a GLP-1 for a year, but if you're still not introducing lifestyle changes, whether that's exercise or dietary habits, long term, it might not be a solution. And I don't think people want to stay on any drug or medication forever. So, but, now we're getting long winded. A lot of GLP-1s actually are tied into the gut and metabolic health. First and foremost, GLP-1, as a peptide is produced in the gut. What it does, and actually what it was first discovered for, was use in sort of diabetes. It naturally stimulates insulin production, which in turn could regulate glucose. It also is kind of, in many ways, through signaling processes, kind of like tricking the brain to be full or satiated. In turn, it's having impacts because it's slowing down like gastric emptying and stuff like that. So I guess you still have this feeling of being more full, although they're There's side effects with now, like you have less bowel movements and you have all these GI issues and stuff like that. So anyhow, GLP-1s are inherently tied into metabolic health, insulin, glucose, GI, and satiation. So that's why I think they're so efficacious. But obviously, we need other interventions to help increase their efficacy, as also alleviate side effects, and then obviously help people wean off them to keep weight off and have a long-term healthier lifestyle, if you will.
Yeah, I agree with everything that you said. I think they do have a place in society, and I think they can be helpful. My caution with them is that it's a quick fix to a very chronic issue. And can they be addictive? Can the results be addictive? And if you come off of them, exactly like you're talking about, like, will you gain the weight back? And does it really teach you to take care of yourself long term versus, hey, like, pop this pill and now you're not going to have any weight anymore and all your issues are quote unquote gone. So I think it does have its place in society. I do, especially with like diabetes and that type of thing. But I almost wish it was like given with a protocol that came with it that said, hey, here you go, but like follow this nutrition and exercise plan as well.
Yeah. Well, I think you hit it on the head, right? And actually, I think this is a direct tie-in to something like V-Nella, this inherent connection between exercise, our gut microbiome, and metabolic health. And I'm happy to dive into the nuances of all those things. But to your point, I think even if you look at, for instance, Eli Lilly, right, which, one of the producers of GLP-1s, them and Novo certainly seem to be the leaders. But for instance, they have a platform called Lilly Direct where you could access their GLP-1 medication. And actually, they have these protocols for things to use in conjunction with GLP-1s to have the desired benefits. And actually, two of the things on there, well, one is just movement, right? And so even Lilly is saying that to make GLP-1s more efficacious, both near and long term, right, exercise is an important part of that. Interestingly enough, the other thing that they say is sleep is a huge aspect of that. And certainly, if you look at some of the side effects, muscle loss or even insomnia, there are direct applications for that. It's funny. I just want to say, tying in metabolic syndrome and stuff like that, I went to this longevity conference last December, and there was this hour-long kind of fireside chat with Peter Attia, who I guess is one of the leading healthcare practitioners, especially in relation to longevity. And I guess he has millions of followers. And it was so crazy. He was talking to thousands of practitioners, and he was really getting into the weeds of the sort of mechanisms and even going into muscle signaling and insulin resistance and stuff. And it's funny, obviously muscle health, he was saying, is inversely correlated with insulin resistance. And obviously insulin resistance is tied into glucose, metabolic health, diabetes, obesity. And after this hour kind of like lecture or whatnot, he said, well, guys, actually, at the end of the day, the number one pharmacological intervention for metabolic syndrome is exercise. And then he said, the number two intervention is sleep. So again, it's like these, semantics or convoluted technicalities of physiology, but at the end of the day, like exercise, like from Eli Lilly to Peter Attia to anyone you could think of, it's like move more, and that's going to help you with both these drugs and long-term physiological solutions.
Wow. I mean, that's great. It's great to just hear it talked about again and again of like, hey, this is really what makes the biggest difference for your health and your longevity.
Yeah. So I want to tie that back into, and I want to reframe it now and think about how you initially reacted to FitBiomics and V-Nella, right? And you're like, okay, John, yeah, you're studying these elite athletes' microbiomes, and that's cool, right? It's be like Mike. I get it. This is for athletes. Maybe it'll help me train for a marathon. But think about what we just spoke about over the last 20 minutes, right? And looking at exercise and movement as medicine. And think about what we spoke about, how evolutionary, right? Hunter-gatherers, right, had to chase after their food. So endurance was essential. And think about us now, sedentary lifestyles, metabolic syndrome, and what we just spoke about. I think that reframes what FitBiomics is doing and the importance of something like V-Nella beyond just training for a marathon, but actually supporting our metabolic health throughout life and longevity, whether we're trying to lose weight, we're using a GLP-1, or we now want to introduce like these healthy metabolic aspects to our physiology. And that's really, I would say, the impact of what FitBiomics and V-Nella is doing.
Yeah, that's really cool. And you're right. It's for the average person. Doesn't matter if they're trading for something or they're not, because there is so much benefit there. And I'm so curious what your physical activity looks like as somebody who sees the benefits, and you're in the research and doing this all the time. Like, how do you kind of incorporate it? Because obviously you're very busy yourself running a company, but you understand the importance of it. So how do you balance that personally?
Yeah, it's kind of funny. So I used to be a former athlete. I played, collegiate basketball, and I always joke I didn't make the NBA, so my backup was getting a PhD in biomedicine. So talk about natural selection. I was kind of forced into being a scientist for survival, if you will. But I think, it gives a sense of my natural inclination towards human performance, as well as like biotech and sort of these health innovations to help broader society and sort of bridging the gap between those. But yeah, I just want to say what's really, really exciting is, I'm not only the president, but, I'm also a client, right? And, what's great about this and biohacking and, myself and my co-founder, Carolina Barca, like we almost are like the perfect manifestations of the people who benefit the most from our innovations. And I'll talk about myself, right? I'm a middle-aged millennial. I'm 43 years old, right? I think for me, having a startup, right, and being so ingrained in translation and stuff like that, obviously fatigue is an issue, right? For me, as I get older, wanting to make sure I'm still moving, I'm still, doing weight training for my muscles and longevity. And when I take V-Nella, it's been really amazing in terms of it giving me more energy. It's kind of interesting. You brought up coffee. I am super sensitive to caffeine. Like I have to drink decaf as almost like a placebo, right? But when I take something like V-Nella, it almost feels like coffee, except without the crash. And it's just has enabled me to be more active, but also the recovery aspect. If you think about lactic acid and just keeping my muscles healthy long term. And these are the things that we've actually seen with a lot of users. And I just want to shout out Carolina Barca, my co-founder, for her super passionate about women's health and, how women have historically been excluded from sort of research and things of that nature. And just the things she's dealt with in terms of her GI issues, IBS, fatigue, and like, we have a lot of like middle-aged sort of like women who are in their perimenopausal state where whether it's dealing with kids or dealing with life or dealing with their boyfriends or husbands, right? They're like, holy shit, John, like I'm tired all the time. But, taking something like V-Nella is giving them the natural energy they need to be more active and take on, daily life in general. So it's for us, it's just you're integrating probiotic into your life, and it's sort of like delivering these health benefits that have broad implications on the way we live.
I love that. Yeah, that's really cool. And yeah, I did see that your co-founder is super into women's health and supporting women. And like you said, it's so needed. Like finally, we're having this conversation a lot this year and last year. Because women are kind of always like an afterthought, to be honest, when it comes to supplements and research and health and what we can do. And it's nice to see that really shifting. And so, yeah, thank you for like actually spending time and energy working in the women's health space and supporting women, because it is really needed.
Yeah, well, with V-Nella, we have all the energy we need, so we could tackle these huge issues. But yeah, I think what's also really cool about FitBiomics is just, one of our core values is just diversity. And that also, as it pertains to biological diversity, right? So this notion of studying the biology of not, the most fit people in the world, but in a gender neutral aspect, right? And actually, the microbes that we're discovering isolating, they come from both women and men. And I will neither confirm nor deny whether or not something like V-Nella was isolated from a woman, but let's just say there's a good chance that it was. But again, it's having these gender neutral benefits, right, for men and women. But what's also fascinating is how men and women have different health needs and how they're benefiting slightly different with something like V-Nella because of this interaction between society, physiology, and diet. and sort of the needs it's creating in, different genders.
It makes sense, right? Like typically women train differently than men. They eat differently. The amount of food they eat is different when they eat, the type of food. Even women tend to be better at self-care than men. Men tend to I don't know, kind of ignore it until it becomes too big of an issue that they have to go and see somebody to get help type of vibe. And it makes sense that the probiotic strains that you would take would show up differently in men and women because the lifestyles tend to be different and the biology is different, right? So it makes sense. Yeah.
But, I also want to say something, and this is tying back into the mechanisms of GLP-1, and we kind of said insulin and glucose and satiation and GI, sort of slowing bowel movement. What I love about science, right, is how objective it is, or at least it should be, right? Now, there's context dependence, obviously physiology, gender, environment, and stuff like that. But if you look at something like lactic acid metabolism, right, that is fairly objective. Right now, what we're learning is we actually don't know as much about it as we thought we did. And I think lactic acid historically is one of the most misunderstood sort of molecules in our body. And also this notion of who could benefit from improved lactic acid metabolism. So, a lot of people think something like lactate, what causes fatigue, or it's a bad thing. And actually, it's not. It's naturally produced in our bodies. It's a natural energy source. It's an energy source for our muscles, for our brain, things of that. And what we thought, it obviously accumulates in our blood after intense exercise. So therefore, elevated levels are associated with fatigue. Now, this is where it gets interesting. Traditionally, it was thought that most of lactate goes into our liver, where it gets converted into glucose. But actually, what we discovered by looking at these ultramarathoners is that a significant portion of lactate actually goes into your gut. And that's where it serves as like a food source for something like V-Nella, which is now converting it into propionate, which in turn has all these amazing benefits in our body. It's like this very different energy source that's also anti-inflammatory. It's having benefits in our gut. It's having benefits in our muscles. It's having benefits in our brain. So something like that is very, very objective, and something like that can objectively help a lot of different people, which is what's so excited about it. So yeah, really, really cool.
Yeah, that is really cool. That's really exciting. I feel like there's just so much to come product-wise, but also research-wise that we could really dive into. And it's great that it's becoming more and more easy to do the research and more accessible as well. If people want to try this, if there's someone listening who's saying, hey, look, I'm struggling with fatigue, or I want to improve my sleep or energy or endurance, where can they go and how can they connect with you? Because I think there's going to be a lot of people who are like, yeah, this is for me. I want to give this a go.
Yeah, it's very simple. Go to FitBiomics.com, FitBiomics.com. This is something, I just want to put this into perspective, not to geek out. My background, biomedicine, right, getting a PhD, traditional biotech is 10 years and billions of dollars to develop a drug, less than 10% success rate, right? And then if you think about those drugs, a lot of times they come in maybe a little too late, right? They're important, right, to treat disease, but a lot of times also they're unaffordable and not accessible. Now think about something like V-Nella, right? We mentioned GLP-1s were discovered 40 years ago. We literally discovered V-Nella something like 7 years ago, right? And since publishing it in Nature Medicine, we've rapidly translated it into this consumer health product, right? That's profoundly changing the way we optimize our bodies. And we've done it in a fraction of the time with orders of magnitude less capital, right? So I put that in perspective because part of our company value and mission is, right, to accelerate health innovations, right, to broader populations and to make them affordable. So something like V-Nella you could get access to on FitBiomics.com, and it's literally something like $2 a day, right? It's cheaper than coffee. It's cheaper than prebiotic sodas, right? It's cheaper than protein drinks, and it's certainly cheaper than GLP-1s, right? So there's a place to introduce V-Nella to people that just want to be less tired and move more.
Amazing. I love that. And yeah, thank you for breaking that down. I think that's really important and inspiring for people to understand that this is actually something affordable and something that most people can have access to. I will link that in the show notes and on my podcast website so that everyone can find you super easily. Thank you so much for taking the time today to come on the show. I learned a lot from you, and yeah, I think my listeners will as well.
Amazing. Thanks for having me. This was a lot of fun.
Thanks for tuning into Biohacking with Brittany. If you love this episode, make sure to subscribe, leave a review, and share it with someone on their own wellness journey. Stay connected with me on Instagram at BiohackingBrittany for more on high performance health, non-toxic living, and the latest in biohacking. Until next time, keep striving for your healthiest, most vibrant self.